I think people will join us here as they can, but let's go ahead and call the meeting to order at 6:57, so that's enough time. So we have a little work session here. We'll get right into it. Our first item up for discussion is our PBIS and rethinking our school discipline. I don't know who's going to kick it off. Matt, I just probably kick it off and send it off to
I'd make a couple of comments and then see if Amy has anything before she turns over to Sarah and Rachel. But if you remember, one of our equity priorities that we tried to zero in on, I guess, the summer and start of the fall was really looking at our discipline protocols and procedures, and then also looking at a little more holistically around our PBIS and just rethinking the nature of discipline and how we teach behavior, I think is an important component of that as well. And so we put together a process throughout, and we've been providing you updates on that. Tonight is really your opportunity to respond to some of the components that have been shared and to share some of your thoughts. And so with that, I'll let Amy introduce Rachel and Sarah and see if she has anything else she'd want to add on there from an intro standpoint.
Thanks, Matt. So just a quick update, although I know I'm going to give one at the next board meeting. With this particular committee, we have now met 4 of our 10 times. We'll meet through the end of March to continue our work around revisiting the DPP, looking for bias in the language, thinking about restorative practices that we can add, and then making the manual itself more holistic. And so add the pieces around PBIS, which then encompass things like trauma-informed care or SEL competencies, culturally responsive teaching strategies. But as kind of a 3-pronged approach with it, that the meat of the work is being done in the working group. But then we went out and did that stakeholder survey for 3 weeks in December, and then held 2 public forums and listening sessions. And so as we're wrapping up listening sessions, you're a critical group. And actually, the questions that Rachel and Sarah are going to pose for you tonight are different than what were asked in the other listening sessions that were offered with some other groups. And they can talk to you kind of about the genesis or why they got to are using that approach. But without further ado, Rachel and Sarah previously with the U of I and is now out at the University of Delaware. Rachel's still with the U of I, but have held a long-standing partnership with us in our equity-related work. So I'll turn it over to you, ladies. Thank you for being here and for waiting for 2 hours.
Waiting 2 hours is nothing. This is the earliest we've ever had a board working session with you all. So, thank you very much. And I'm on East Coast time, so it's like 8 o'clock. It's my bedtime. So anyways, thank you very much for allowing us to have this opportunity to speak with you this evening. As Matt and Amy sort of described the process, I'll just go ahead and dive right in. So we are here to do a listening session with you. So what that really means is we'll go through some of what we've learned through this inclusive process that we're helping to facilitate. So we'll share with you the results that we have from the 2 public forums that were done in December. At one of them, about 40 people were there, and at the other one, about 20 people were there. But the public survey that was sent out to all ICCSD community members, teachers, parents, students, everybody, we actually got about 1,000 usable responses to that. We got a lot more responses, but they weren't usable because they didn't fill out the survey. They didn't leave any actual information. Rachel will tell you what the prompts for that survey were and what the prompts were for the public forums, as well as the listening sessions that we have already done with the different stakeholder groups. So the prompts we used in all of those, the public forums, the public survey, and the listening sessions were all pretty much the same. And they're really about what are your concerns, and then what are your ideas for addressing these concerns. So Rachel is going to walk through what we've learned from all of this public engagement. And then I'm going to help facilitate a conversation asking you a couple of questions that, as Amy mentioned, are different because your role in the district really is very unique. And we want to leverage the idea that we've already learned quite a lot from all of this public engagement and information that's been shared. And we really want to have an opportunity not only to share that with you, but to sort of talk about sort of directions moving forward. Rachel?
Yes, already. Hello, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the information that we learned from the surveys and the forums It's quite a bit. People talked about a whole range of things, as you'll see. I'll talk about the concerns first and then all the ideas people had, but I'm going to go through it pretty briefly. There's going to be a report that I'm making that you will see, I think, in a couple weeks that goes through it all a lot more detailed in case you're interested in actually reading a lot more about it. So this is, sorry, it's a little overwhelming. People talked about a lot of different concerns, and these kind of all fell into different themes that people talked about. A big one is just the general approach that the district takes to behavior and discipline. People talked a lot about, well, one, racial disproportionality, discipline being too punitive, lack of restorative practices, it not being culturally responsive, wanting PBIS to be more consistently implemented, having more of an education and support approach than a discipline and punishment approach. So a lot of people were just concerned about the general framework and approach to discipline in the district. People also talked a lot about social and emotional learning, especially students. They talk a lot about bullying that goes on in schools and issues related to equity and inclusion, which often overlaps with bullying, and just general mental health concerns, curriculum related to these things, drug use, school pressure. And then going on to like these disciplinary values, a lot of people talked about a lack of equitable treatment, it not being consistent, it not being transparent, not really having student voice in it, maybe not being responsive all the time. In regards to student behavior, a lot of people had concern about, are students being held accountable? What do we do when students misbehave? There's just a lot of disruption in classrooms, and how do we handle that? And just standards expectations. Moving on to the staff, teacher, and admin role, people talking about training. Is there adequate or enough training? A lack of support, and just a lack of staffing, especially like mental health type staffing. And then but misbehavior that staff does sometimes. And then just general student engagement, family engagement, and then some responses about concern about police involvement in the use of seclusion rooms. So then the ideas for addressing these all kind of fall pretty much in line with all of these concerns. So with the discipline and behavior approach, people wanted more of a clear behavioral intervention system. They wanted it more PBIS, but especially PBIS to be more culturally responsive, having it be more restorative, and just more of a proactive approach to discipline is kind of where people's heads were at in the community. For student behavior, wanting more clear, like exactly what are the rules, what are the consequences, and everybody be on the same page about that. Having more accountability to standards, expectations for student behavior so they know what the rules are and what will happen. And the disciplinary values, so they want it to be more responsive, so teachers are actually addressing behavior that is concerning to other students, more communication about what is going on, what are the policies and practices, just consistency within schools, across schools, having more students be a part of developing these things and also have more of a voice when discipline does occur. Professional development, this was like the biggest one, professional development on restorative justice, culturally responsiveness, behavior management, and social and emotional well-being were the main topics people wanted development on. And just more staff diversity, more accountability for staff, and then supporting them. And then looking at social emotional environment that kids are in, having a more preventative approach to bullying and being more responsive when that occurs, focusing on inclusion, SEL, more counselors and staff, more mental health support. A lot of these concerns I'm sure y'all have heard of before that have been raised. And then student engagement, making sure students are more engaged and involving parents more, communicating with them more, and supporting them more throughout this process. So these are kind of the big, so this kind of shows you there's a lot of different things to consider when approaching behavior and discipline, and people are thinking about a whole range of concerns and ideas when we talk about addressing it. And Sarah will lead you all through a discussion about all this info.
Yeah, so as Rachel mentioned, there's a lot of information. I know we just ran through that very quickly, but what we're trying to do today is just to give you a sense of what that is. We will produce a report that has all of the sort of analysis that went into that brief sort of synopsis. But tonight, what we really wanted to do is sort of pull together a couple of discussion questions for you that really reflect some of the most prominent and consistent concerns that were raised, and then ideas and suggestions for moving the work forward. And so we're going to ask you questions about 4 of those. So the first one is about culturally responsive or anti-racist and restorative concerns and desires to move in that direction. And so these were the kind of things that people raised most in relation to racial disproportionality and disciplinary outcomes. And so many of these were the kinds of things that were raised about changes that they would like to see in the approach to student behavior and discipline. And so the two questions for you all that we'd like to hear your thoughts about is, one, are you supportive in moving in this direction? And two, what do you see as challenges of moving in this direction?
I'll start.
Thank you.
Really easy. Yes, I'm supportive in moving in this direction. It's the right thing for our district, our students, and our staff. The challenges I see of moving in this direction is changing the way people have always done things that have created issues where our discipline hasn't been culturally responsive or restorative. So I think changing the mindset of our teachers, staff, administrators, and even some of our students will be difficult for us as a community and as a district.
Yeah, thank you.
I was getting ready to jump in and Ruthina beat me to it. Like Ruthina, I think that's the first question is an easy yes. The second question is a lot harder. I think systemic racism is the first thing that comes to mind. I know that just trying to get a book into our school district that has the words anti-racism in it has been met with a significant pushback. I think there's a lot of that feeling of, well, if the kids were misbehaving, they wouldn't be in trouble sort of feeling, right? And I think that's what we're fighting and trying to really get folks to understand what anti-racist means as opposed to just not being a racist, because those are very different things. And I think people could be put into one bucket and not the other. And that's going to be a significant barrier, I think, as we move forward here.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? Are you thinking, when you say our community, are you thinking that it's like parents and students when you're saying community? Or are you thinking also our community as in also staff and teachers and folks like that?
I think it's fair to say that it would be all of them. I was specifically thinking, just because of the context of the book I was mentioning, it was much more parents pushing back. But I do think we're going to meet that same resistance across the board, because it's asking people, as Ruthina said, is to change your mindset about things. And people always assume that they're in the right. And in getting people to think a different way is, that's not an easy task for any of them. And, our staff falls into those same pitfalls as much as, our families do, and us for that matter.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Other thoughts?
I'll jump in real fast and sort of echo Sean and Ruthina. Yes, supportive of moving this direction. I would echo their discussion of the challenges. I think another challenge, or to add on, is obviously we've got societal systemic racism at play at all levels of our society right now. I think for us to really tackle this in our district is going to require a lot of painful self-reflection at the individual level, and people, we need to decide that we're signing up for this, and that level of vulnerability, willingness to be open and learn, challenge our own assumptions, ways of thinking, and just there's going to be a personal, each of us are going to have to take this on in a personal way. And I think that's hard, especially to do it in sort of these public forums. And so I think that personal reflection is going to be a challenge, and something we just have to agree to support each other on.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an important point as well. Any other responses to this particular, this is our first topic of 4 topics that we're going to talk about.
I would say, yeah, am I supportive of moving in this direction? For sure. Challenges. I was trying to think of this in terms of as a classroom teacher, which I have never been and obviously know nothing about. But it seems to me that office referrals are the big thing that are disproportionate. So what would have to happen so that a classroom teacher, instead of saying, okay, kid, you badmouthed me the last time, go to the office. What happens to, what has to happen to change that so that that classroom teacher does more restorative things instead of saying, go to the office? I don't actually know what that looks like or what it might look like. And personally, for me as a board member, I'd like to have a better understanding of how that interaction should work as opposed to what's happening now.
Yeah, I think what you're starting to get at is actually some of the two topics that come next about the other sort of moves in a different direction in terms of moving this work forward in the district. So the second thing that we want to ask you about is that, as you heard when Rachel was going through the concerns and the ideas for change, a big sort of concern was, especially by students, was a desire to have more attention and resources devoted to mental, emotional, and behavioral health supports, and to focus less on reactionary discipline procedures and protocols. And so a same set of questions, are you supportive of moving in this direction? And the second is, what do you see as the challenges of moving in this direction specifically?
I guess I can start by saying yes. I am supportive of this. A challenge that comes to mind is obviously sometimes actions that occur are based upon how somebody's emotional or mental state. Most of the time, that's what it is. A challenge for me would be that students, teachers, whoever will not be willing to talk about how they will not be able to, or they won't be willing to talk about their emotional or their mental state. So for me, if I'm a Black person, I wouldn't want to speak about my emotional, my mental state with a white person, because I feel they won't understand where I'm coming from. And so I don't know how that will be addressed going forward, or what we'll be doing as a team, or what you would, I guess, recommend for us to do in that manner. So that's a challenge I see there.
Yeah, that's a big one. Thank you.
I'll throw out the very traditional challenge that we always face, is that it's time and money, right? I think that we want to move in this direction. I think it's having the right people and or the right training for the people that are, in the classrooms and doing the work. And those things are tough to do, in a limited finance and limited time and things like that. So those are real barriers of, as we talk about, on the last question, changing kind of mindsets. It does begin with learning and finding the time to do that, and the cost associated with that is difficult.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
Sarah, is this question about giving more attention and resources mental, emotional, or behavioral health supports of students or of the teachers?
Most of them were about students, and students saying that those are things that they would like. Rachel, do you have any recollection of the number that were more about staff or teachers?
There's definitely a less number, but there still was like a portion of teachers that wanted more mental health support and just like support in general. But there are some, I like that you brought that up, Charlie, because there is some concern that not only students want this kind of support or need this kind of support, but teachers do as well right now.
And do you have any indication that the students indicating wanting more of these kinds of supports are students that are being sent to offices or not?
We didn't ask that in the survey, so we didn't ask information like that. We just asked, are you a student, parent, teacher, community member, et cetera? And then, what's your concern and what's your idea to address it? So it wasn't a holistic survey about your experiences in school.
I'll just chime in because I do 100% agree that this needs to be the direction moving forward for our students. But I'll just piggyback on Charlie's thought there. I think for us to get there for our students, we also need to make sure we're providing that for our staff, because they need to be in a healthy emotional and mental state in order to discipline in a manner that takes those things into account. So even though we're dealing with the constraints of money, we need to figure out a way to ensure that the people we have in our building are getting what they need to ensure then that our students are getting what they need.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that reminds me of, I sat on a task force for the Department of Education for Iowa several years ago when they were coming out with their SEL recommendations. And that was one of the major points that came up in that task force was you need to address the SEL of teachers and educators before you can really talk about how to roll it out to students. Other thoughts and comments about supportive emotional mental health needs before we move on to the third one? All right, why don't we move on to the third one? So the third one is really speaking to what Matt and Amy sort of started us out with. So even starting to engage in this work, you all asked us to help think about this very holistically. And this is something that is really coming out very strongly with the range of things that people are looking at as being connected, and which very much are connected in terms of concerns and student outcomes. And so one of the suggestions that we're hearing over and over again and is starting to kind of bubble up is a desire to have a more integrated and holistic approach. So integrated meaning thinking about both student behaviors and supports and discipline all as being aligned. So that's everything from PBIS to your DPP to restorative practices or orientations to culturally responsiveness. And so one, again, are you supportive of moving in this more holistic and integrated way? And what do you see as the challenge of doing this?
Well, I'll be frank here. I have no idea what this is all about. I mean, for one thing, I don't know what these various components actually are, what they do. And my first impression, we saw this question actually the other night, is that this is way too complicated to get at what we need to get at, which could be something as simple as teacher racism. So.
Other thoughts or reactions?
Yeah, I agree with Charlie. I like to think that I'm pretty smart and I have no idea what this means.
You
Like,
are. So.
Thanks, Charlie. That's very nice of you. It is just a bunch of education, like hot talking points to me, pushed together in one sentence. So it's really hard to support something that I can't understand.
So sort of piggyback, I think I understand the words. My reaction to this one was it feels like a lot and like boiling the ocean, doing everything at once. And so I think maybe, break it down, be a bit more descriptive of what these things are, what the goals are for each of these pieces. And then, it's hard to argue with restorative practices, cultural responsiveness. I'm a huge fan of PBIS. I think all these things do have a part, but I think we need to break it down, describe things more distinctly, and then sort of prioritize a course of action to get there. Because I mean, this is this is major culture change through so many values, behaviors, practices, procedures. This is giant. And so I think it's a little overwhelming and why it's hard to get our arms around. At least that was my impression.
Yeah, no, I think it's super helpful to hear that these are kind of your guys' initial impressions. They were very much sort of some of the initial impressions of work group members as well. So we spent some work group time saying, okay, what is the DPP? What is its purpose and what was its goals? Why did it come to be? What is PBIS and how does the district do PBIS? When people say culturally responsive practices, what do they mean? And what is the district currently doing around culturally responsive teaching practices? And then same thing with restorative justice. You know, what is the district currently doing and what do we mean by those kind of practices or that kind of an orientation? And so one of the ideas behind posing this to you all tonight and thinking of this as a potential direction moving forward is that you all do many, many things. You all meaning the district. You do those things that I just mentioned. You do trauma-informed care. You do mental and emotional support. You do SEL. You know, you do all of these things. But yet, you know, over the 5 to 6 years we've worked with the district, a lot of the numbers haven't changed. There's racial disproportionality in almost all aspects of student experiences in school, all kinds of outcomes, everything from office referrals to suspensions, you know, and so you're doing all of these things. And so if you're doing a lot of different things, but you're not having the results that you're wanting and expecting, and there's lots of good folks, you know, professionals trying to do this work on a daily basis, it starts to call into question, you know, yes, you can continue to silo them, you know, or to think about them as each distinct things. But there also is a point that you might, you know, and this is why this is a question for you all, you know, as part of the leadership of the district to think about, you know, what would you see as challenges in doing this? And, you know, whether or not you agree or disagree with the idea that that would even be a fruitful direction to go.
I
This
just
one
wanted
is,
to try.
oh, sorry,
Oh,
Ruthina.
go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was just
Maybe
gonna say, I know
straight to
this is
whatever.
pitched to the board, but I think Sarah did a nice job articulating the challenge there and why I would say, you know, and that this one's important for us, because when we look at each of those terms individually, I think all of us would say, yes, that's good, right? Do that, you know, do culture responsive instruction, do PBIS, have a solid discipline protocol and procedure book. We want to do restorative justice. And then like Sarah said, we're trying to do all these things at once, but if they're not talking to each other, you might have the best part in all of those pieces, but it doesn't make the car run. And so in some way we have to make the car run, and we have to be able to put that all together to be able to drive forward and see the outcomes we want. And so not to give you guys an answer that you don't believe in, but I think the challenge for us is just doing that in itself, is making it all talk together, because I think we're committed to the right work and we know what the right work to do is, but how do we network it all together? And you guys are just expressing, I think, some of the challenge that Sarah said the work group expresses, what our staff says, you know, that you have this laundry list of all these different things you want us to do. Well, how's it all fit? You know, how do I do all of this at once? I think that's the challenge in itself. So not to get you off track from your own listening session and comment period back, but that one was too good to kind of let go.
And I just want to piggyback on what Matt said, because we do have to take all of these things, not as silo as Sarah mentioned, but how do we get them to work all together to make the car move? But in order to do that, all parts need to be functioning independently before we bring them together. So I think it's important to look at those to ensure that we're using PBIS with fidelity across all of our buildings, that we're addressing issues within our discipline policy and procedures that, in my personal view, has to be inherently biased when we see the numbers that we see for our students that's presented. So I won't belabor the subject.
I'll belabor it a little bit. I guess kind of Matt's description probably changed my thinking just a little bit, but in my head, and maybe this is, if you're asking what's something we're going to come up against or as a barrier here, in my head, I was like, how are we not looking at all these things holistically, like already? Like, how are we not doing that? It seems to make perfect sense that all these things work in concert. We've had many conversations as a board in a lot of different topics, and you see everything as they overlap and interact, and you see all this intersectionality. And that was my first thought was, well, of course we're looking at it holistically. So maybe that's the barrier, is that people don't realize that just because we're doing a lot of things doesn't also mean we're doing them all together well. And so that's my own bias I'm coming in with, I guess. And so maybe that's a barrier that we're going to fight with other folks as well.
Well, I think it's different depending on the level you are in the organization too, right? Like we may have this a good handle of how we think these all work together on the district level, but when it comes to a classroom teacher level and they're asked to put all of these things together, we haven't done, maybe the work to connect the dots. And so I think that's a good point, Sean. I mean, even we can think we're doing that, but in practice, it may not be making it to where it needs to.
So I'm sorry, the other board members haven't had a chance to talk. I should not jump in here.
I'll give you my time, Charlie. Go ahead.
Oh, so, you may regret that. So how long has the district, Matt, in your view, been actively engaged in cultural responsive practices or training?
In a holistic fashion, I don't think I'd have a lot of confidence saying that we've done something that would have touched the whole staff like we've done before this year. I think we've done bits and pieces. The buildings have led work that even from a district, we may have had minimal efforts, but I think this year we really take a concerted effort to make sure we've touched all staff with training and PD through our monthly sessions. So it's hard to say that because I think, again, it goes to the holistic piece. We might have done bits and pieces of that work before, but if we're serious about culturally responsive instruction and that really happening everywhere you'd look in the district, I think that's how we've tried to take a fresh look at it this year. PBIS, I would say with a lot more, confidence that work's been going on in the district for a number of years.
And the same thing would hold
The
true.
other thing I would just,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sarah. Or Amy, I'm sorry.
it was me, Charlie. I was just gonna say, Matt's, I would say had answered exactly how Matt did around culturally responsive teaching, that's just kind of now being brought to the staff through Loris PD. The thing that I feel like has not been standardized, but there's been a lot of work around, but not pushed out through the district level, is the restorative justice and restorative practices piece. And I think that's where we're gonna make our money. I mean, I think that's also a huge component that probably is gonna be an outcome of this work, that needs to probably be a next step where it's more standardized. But I hear you all talking about how these pieces all sound important. How do they intersect? And the really good question posed is, are we trying to do too much, to Sarah's point, and not seeing the results that we want to see? So again, it's your listening session. I don't want to dominate.
I think one other thing I would add too, do you mind, Charlie?
No, go ahead, sure.
Is, you can think of it as, like there's the front end and there's the back end. So there's the PBIS and the preventative, and then there's the reactionary sort of DPP and disciplinary policies and protocols. And one of the reasons we bring up, how integrated you want them to be is you can just think in terms of, PBIS, the preventative versus reactive. Like it makes a lot of sense to think about those as an integrated system. But the other reason why we're sort of starting to talk about holistic approaches is because the other two, the cultural responsiveness and the restorative orientation and practices, those are things that you could embed within that entire spectrum from preventative to reactionary. And so it wouldn't just be, oh, now we do 3 or 4 things and they're all separate things. So that's another one of the reasons why we're kind of trying to sort of gauge where you all are thinking with the holistic nature of the approach.
I should quip here that I'm probably the last person you should be asking about what I'm thinking, because this is feel like it's way above my head. So, or I guess I should say, I just don't have a clear idea of how to proceed.
Yeah.
The notion was that I came into this with was that teachers are disciplining mainly Black students. That's the ones that have far the most disproportionality. They're disciplining Black students because the teachers are acting from a racist standpoint.
So if the answer was easy, Charlie, and you already had it, then you'd be like holding out on us and we would all be really mad at you. So I know that our time is running out, and I do want to pose the very last question before we run away and give you the rest of your evening back. So the fourth thing is really about communication, transparency. So this is both everything from awareness of what district level and building level policies and practices are, to things like expectations for students and staff and teachers. So lots of comments and concerns and ideas about how to improve these things, you know, in terms of communication and being transparent and making things clear to all actors in the system, whether they're students or teachers or parents. So the question here is different, which is, you know, given what the very limited amount that we shared with you, but also just your experience in terms of communication and engagement with family and parents, families and students, etc. What suggestions do you have for how to increase communication and transparently and parent and student engagement in the district, sort of policies and practices related to student behavior and discipline?
I'll jump in here. We have a, you know, much like we do with our school district at work, right? We have an annual survey, and it's geared towards employee engagement, right? And all of those things. And every year, the biggest concern is there's lack of communication. And so every year you do the survey, and then you come up with a plan on how to increase communication. And then the next year it's communication's terrible, right? So I think whether it's their school district or anything else, it's all about trust, right? Because if you can communicate everything all the time, everywhere, and people still don't trust you, they think you're not communicating something. Like you're holding it back or hiding it or doing things in secret. And that's just the way it is if there isn't trust. And so I think that's the piece in order to have people finally thinking that you're communicating well, is that they trust the fact that what you're telling them is the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And I don't know how you begin to rebuild that trust other than being as transparent and honest and communicative as you can. But until people really start to buy into it, they're still going to think you're not giving them the whole story. And that's universal, I think.
Something that came to mind when I was looking at this, and I was like Sean, kind of reflecting on some of the practices where I work. And I think something that we can continue to do is just to continuously talk about our core values in the district. And I've seen more evidence of that in the last year around what we believe, what we will not tolerate, the kinds of behaviors we're expecting teachers, staff, students, community members to engage in. And so just this, you know, constantly core values, core values, core values. And then maybe that articulation could help, you know, connect the dots from that last conversation on all these different practices that we're trying to implement. All of those things should be reflective and moving us forward from a core value standpoint. And of equity, which I believe we've said over and over and over and over as a core value of ours, we just have to keep saying it in different ways, in different forums, and not missing an opportunity to bring that equity lens into every conversation that we have, to continuously demonstrate that this is a core value. And we won't, you know, we're not going to be tolerant of behaviors that are not reflective of and supporting those core values. And so anyway, it's just a thought on how to, you know, be very, very transparent about those core values.
I know that this is about communication and transparency, and I just want to add to what Janet said, that as much as we focus on communication, if we still dwell or we echo our core values and in our actions, it's not seen, then obviously that doesn't get us anywhere. I know that recently with all the things that have happened, well, in 2020 with race and with race especially, people organizations have come up with core values, and they always say that, oh, we have processes in place for things that happen, but their actions don't reflect the processes that they have in place. And so if we don't put all these things in action, then the communication piece, people don't even see it in the first place. So as much as we are thinking about echoing the core values and all the things that we stand for and being transparent, that should be reflected in our actions as well, in the classroom and in the district as a whole.
I really agree with everything Sean and Drami and Janet said. I would also say that in my experience, the communication occurs much more readily among smaller groups of people, and in settings where other people are more comfortable than I am. And I also think that principals, teachers, student family advocates, everyone, paras, everyone who's in contact with students are going to be some of the main communicators we have as we go forward here with the convincing parents and or students and parents that our values are what we say they are. So the more we can do, to expose ourselves to what in small groups, and the more we can rely on and trust people who are in the classrooms and who are managing buildings, I think that'll help us a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for all of your time that you spent with us this evening. I don't want to take the rest of your evening. I really appreciate your openness to sort of have a dialogue and share your initial thoughts about these things. We are in the midst of the process. So this is, I'm sure, Amy, you can wrap it up, and Matt, you can wrap it up to let them know what all you guys are planning on doing. We're just here to partner with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah and Rachel, for leading that. And thank you, directors, for sharing your thoughts there. I just want to make sure I take the opportunity. I think I would be remiss if I did not, just to give you a heads up, and maybe you have good awareness around it, but as we continue to talk about and promote and think more about restorative practices and restorative justice, when I think about those things that fall under the umbrella of equity, that's potentially an area where we're going to see resistance from, certain sectors of the community potentially. And I just want to give you a heads up there. So when Matt brought to you, initially the math discussion in a work session a couple of years ago about potential changes to the sequence of courses there, or the things around maybe attendance zone changes. This could potentially be in one of those areas where we're going to have to be brave and take a stance on what we believe in, because it's not always a topic that's met favorably in all communities. I would just leave it at that. Matt, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you did a nice job of buttoning it up there, Amy. And I think I'd just connect it back to the comment Sarah made to Charlie. I mean, if there was a playbook for it, we'd be doing it already, right? And so I think that's the part where Amy talks about having some courage to do the work and to try to commit to best practices. But it's not that this is, there's a universal design for how this works perfectly in a lot of different places. I mean, we can take research and we can take small wins and successes we've seen from other places and try to incorporate it in our system. But I don't think I'm going too far in saying that some of this is cutting edge work. I mean, this is the next phase of where public ed needs to improve in the work we're trying to engage in. But we can't rest our laurels on just feel good about taking on the work. I mean, our students deserve results and we deserve better outcomes for our kids. And so it's that critical. And so I really appreciate you guys having the conversation this evening, and we're excited to bring these products back to you as we go along.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, and now, unfortunately, we don't get our evening back because we still have another topic. And now that we're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, we have a nice, exciting conversation around the budget. So I don't know who wants to.
Sure, I'll kick it off and then take it to Chase here. So thanks, Sean. We are going to do a little talk on the budget tonight and kind of do a component of some shared understanding as we get into these conversations this spring. And so Chase and Les are going to lead you through that conversation tonight. But just so you know why we're having this conversation, remember when we talked about our enrollment, we know we're down close to 300 students, and that's going to impact our budget. And then as we've looked at our budget the last couple of years, we knew with taking on a third comprehensive high school and after some of that SBRC relief went away, that it was going to be a crunch for our budget. We had that conversation last year prior and had to do some minimal things. But this year we are up against a challenge. And so with that, I'll let Chase take it from there and get us into the meat of it.
Thanks, Matt. Good evening again. And we do recognize it's late. The good news is really this is just a primer for what's to come in the next few weeks. The last meeting in January is really when we kick off the official budget process with providing budget assumptions. And so we wanted to take a few minutes this evening and kind of give some budget basics. We have really two outcomes that we would like to get through. First is just some education about the process and some of the things that Matt mentioned, and then also start to engage a little bit about what the board would like to see us incorporate in the budget assumptions that we bring forward to kick off the budget work at the end of the month. The one thing I would add to what Matt shared before I turn it over to Les, and ask you to keep in mind as we go through the presentation and then come back to a discussion at the end, is that the board has a directive for the superintendent about an unspent balance and where the board would like that unspent balance to remain, or what would like to see us achieve as a goal. As Matt pointed out, with our decline in enrollment, we're also seeing a projected decline in that unspent balance. And so we're going to need some guidance from the board in terms of, where they want to see the unspent balance, especially as it compares to that directive that the board has in board policy. And so I just lay that out there as well to keep in the back of your mind, and some of the things that we're going to need some help and some guidance on for us to do work before we come back to you in 2 weeks. And so Les, I'll turn it over to you to walk through some of the basics and start sharing information.
Okay, go ahead and advance it, Chase. Good evening, board members. We're going to start with just a few of the basics. I'm not going to read this to you, but just a reminder that this is a process that's done every year. It must be done by April 15th, and it really establishes the district's property tax rate and the overall spending authority of the district. It does not generate the line item budget for specific teacher or staff or utilities or anything of that nature. That's all built on within the overall budget. The certified budget component really has several components that drive this formula through the state aid and levy process. The certified enrollment, as Matt alluded to, where we're down 286 students from the prior year. The certified budget, based upon the state legislature, sets the district and state cost per pupil. As you're probably aware, the Iowa law says they're supposed to do this 2 years in advance. So this should have been set already last year for 21-22, but it was not. So they're doing it now. The governor spoke at 6 o'clock tonight. I just was searching and I could not find if she had made an education recommendation or not. But there's nothing more in this presentation about the governor's recommendation. And then it has some board approved levies that are approved through the certified budget process. And we'll introduce a concept about budget guarantee resolution here in just a minute. These are just the variables that go into the budget with the various levies, the SBRC actions. You took 2 of those tonight regarding dropout prevention, and then the environmental hazards. And I brought to you earlier this fall the limited English program and the special ed deficits that would go in there. And in most years we have advanced enrollment. When our enrollment is going up, we are able to include that in the part of the budget variables, but obviously that's not there this year. There's also the management fund needs that fund our property casualty liability and workers' comp that are mandated by state law. And then whatever we do from an early retirement perspective. And then we have our debt service needs for all of the bonds that have been approved by the board, essentially by the voters in the September 2017 bond referendum. I mentioned that this process sets the maximum spending authority. This kind of just lays out the various pieces that go into that amount, which is the controlled budget. It's essentially enrollment times the cost per pupil. Adds the state instructional program and the preschool aid, miscellaneous income, special ed deficit, prior spending authority, and then those SBRC applications that we were just alluding to. And the maximum budget authority is presented on the quarterly reports that you get 4 times a year. So it's a number that you will see repeatedly throughout the year. Now the district's budget, when we get to some of the more finer details, is made up of about 15% that's non-personnel factors. And those are listed here. those are things that we don't have a lot of control out of. The AEA flow through is about $7 million out of our $170 million budget. It's formula driven. We can't change it. Can't reduce it. We can't increase it. There's a certain amount of utilities that we need to operate our buildings. There's open enrollment and there's transportation, which are the other big pieces in this that we need to get our kids to school. And a lot of those decisions on the transportation come through the board if there's any extra charges. But the big piece of the school district's budget is the 85% that goes to our personnel costs. And I've just broken down here for you to show the various employee groups that make up the personnel costs. And you can see the certified staff and paraprofessionals make up 80% of our budget, of our personnel budgets. So we're putting a really large percentage of our budget into our classrooms, and that's what you would expect, and that's what we should be doing. And then the other groups there that make that up. We did not include here, since we're working at strictly on the operating budget, we did not include nutrition. So it's not to exclude that group of people that are very important to our institution, but we're focusing on the operating budget tonight. So just wanted to make sure that we hadn't forgotten that group of people. The next slide here is the unspent balance. And this is where the state and the Special School Budget Review Committee really focused on the district operations. And you can see 2016, 17, and 18, we were doing pretty good in terms of total overall unspent amounts. And we're meeting that directive that Chase alluded to in his opening comments of the superintendent directive. But as you can see, 19 and 20, we have fallen, and some of that has to do with some budget things. Increased enrollment there that we were averaging 300 students a year into the system required additional staffing. We also opened Liberty High School to its nearly to its fullest capacity during that period and offered all of those programs. And we also opened Grant and New Hoover in that period of time. And so those buildings bring on additional operating costs based upon the way the district is structured. Nobody likes to see those red numbers down there in 23 and 24. And based upon a very conservative estimate of 1% from the state and a conservative student growth estimate, we would be trending into negative territory, potentially in 22, but 567,000 is a very slim margin. But then if you look at 23 and 24, what are the repercussions of going into that negative territory? We would take a carload that would include the board president. No, don't get scared, Sean. The superintendent, and probably Chase and myself down to the school budget review committee and lay out to them a plan of how we're going to get ourselves out of this situation. If you don't correct it within 2 years, then the state will take over, consider the plans to take over the operations of a school district. And so you've seen that recently in Southwest Iowa where they took that one over. And Davenport has recently been in front of the school budget review because of some of their actions in not taking budgetary adjustments. So not to be scare tactics, but that's what that leads to. The next screen is, it's a little hard to read here because it's so compressed, but this is the same doc or piece of information that's in your quarterly financial statements. So it probably is a little easier to read in that document if you want to go back to it. This is for fiscal year 19, and we will be working on updating the fiscal year 20 for the next quarterly report now that districts have closed out fiscal year 20 and it's been reported and summarized for IASB and the Department of Ed. Go ahead, Chase. I mentioned a few minutes ago the budget guarantee provision. There's a provision in the Iowa code that allows for school districts when they have a decrease in enrollment to use the budget guarantee that essentially says the controlled budget portion of their overall district budget will grow by 1% over the next year. It's a one-time boost, if you will, or safety net, maybe is a better word to describe that. If we used a 1% estimate for the state supplemental amount for next year, we would be looking at a budget guarantee of about $2 million to provide that 1% growth in the controlled budget only. That budget guarantee is 100% funded by local property taxes. So you can see that the impact of losing those students would come back directly to our constituents in the school district. The budget guarantee requires a separate board resolution apart from approval of the certified budget, and I would be prepared to present that to the board as early as February so that it is separate and you have taken that appropriate steps. Some districts approve it every year whether they need to or not, so they don't lose sight of it. It's an estimate at 1% that about 250 of the 300 schools in the state of Iowa would need budget guarantee this year. So that does provide some pressure on the legislature to take a look at that and what that impact is on property taxes. But the aid and levy does not restore categorical funding in some of those areas that are presented there, such as the teacher salary supplement, professional PD. And so those areas, when we have declining enrollment, some will stay flat and some will actually decrease just as the enrollment does. So that's a piece that we need to keep an eye on, as well as we're not going to see any growth in those areas, which we have historically seen growth and helps us address student needs with some of those. And there's no provision currently to assist with the decline in the state preschool foundation aid resources. That is estimated based upon our enrollment. Here, as I get to on the next slide, we were down 146 students in our preschool account as part of our overall enrollment decrease. That's going to cause a $500,000 budget decrease for the preschool program for next year. So that's why that is a significant budget hotspot for us to be able to continue to provide those services at the same level, or whether we need to modify that. The property tax rate will be a significant consideration for the board with the budget guarantee going forward. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 cents on our property tax levy, as I've computed it thus far using the 1% assumption. As you know, school districts have limited opportunity to expand their resources. You know, you can have all the bake sales you want, but it doesn't earn you a lot of money in terms of your overall revenues for the district's general fund in terms of expanding the resources available to serve our students. And so the focus needs to be on control or reduction of expenditures. And then to circle back to the superintendent directive on the unspent ballots, you can see where we were there in 2018 and where it's projecting to go forward, or how we've moved down the last 2 years and then projecting for the current year and then into next year. Go ahead, Chase, and if you want to roll that forward.
So
I've covered a lot of territory in a few minutes for the board, and as Chase noted, we will be coming to you in 2 weeks with budget assumptions. And so this is where we would like to entertain your thoughts, your comments on how we move forward with those assumptions. Some of that may be driven by what the governor has said today or what the legislature will do in the next few days with state funding. But at this point, we'll open it up for any of the comments. And Chase and Matt, if there's anything you think that I've missed, jump in as well, please.
Well, just a couple of comments as the board members are digesting this a bit. And we do understand that while a lot of his background, the specific data we shared is pretty heavy. And in all honesty, I've heard the word transparent a lot tonight, and we thought it was important to be upfront with the board prior to actually entering the budget process in 2 weeks. And so, you know, we wanted to make sure that we had an awareness of where we were, and unless I think rightfully so did some conservative estimating. We look at that 1% increase from the state. And, you know, we think that's appropriate as we enter the process. He mentioned the 85% of our dollars going into our staff. As the board's aware, we do all of that through the negotiations process too, which will take place later in the spring. And so we have to look at balancing a couple of different things. And the last thing I would say is, as you look at that last bullet refers to why I opened with when we see that those percentages in terms of the unspent balance. And looking back at from an earlier slide, what that 2020 number, that 0.88 represents from last year was $1.5 million. And as you look at for this year, projected at the end of June 21 of being at $1.7 million, that's 0.88% for our unspent balance. And we really, whether it's tonight or in 2 weeks, like to get some guidance from the board of, do we see this year as somewhat as an anomaly and understand the COVID crisis? Or do we immediately need to start building back towards that 5%? We were on that trajectory with the past boards until we ran into that budget snag a couple of years ago back in 2018. And so unfortunately, we kind of find ourselves on that same wheel of having to repeat that exercise. But right now it's a matter of, do we start that this year, or knowing we're still coming out of COVID, do we do what we can and then start building back that reserve next fiscal year?
So Chase, remind me again what happened in 2018.
So last year going to help me because it was when I was transitioning back, but it had to do with when we knew we were opening schools, and Liberty was coming on. And we found ourselves, Charlie, in a spot where we initially thought we were going to have to trim about $5 million from the budget. And so we made some decisions at that time in terms of looking at staffing. We were able to make the cuts we needed to make without making any layoffs or RIFs, which I think has been something that we've been very good at, about protecting people's jobs in the organization above other pieces. And so, but part of that plan was, after we made those cuts, that we would start building that reserve back towards that 5 to 10%. Well, the enrollment from this past year, that 286 student decline, is really what has put us in a very precarious spot, because our projections didn't anticipate that. As Les, I think, mentioned, we've had continuous student growth for the last 2 decades, and that's what our projections showed. But with COVID last spring, that's dropped off. And so now it's put us in a spot like many other districts, where our models and our planning were saying one thing, but then reality has done something completely different to us in the last 8 months.
Okay, thanks. And again, this is all in the background in my mind anyway, in the context of increased taxable valuation throughout the county.
Sure. And I think the thing I would just add in here is, I think the thing we want to leave you with tonight too is we're just not in a sustainable situation. And so then it's to Chase's point about how aggressive do we want to be in correcting that situation. And so when you look at those historical factors about what arrived us in the position we're in today, it was obviously exacerbated by the decline in enrollment for this year. And then depending on how some of these variables start to get solved for us around SSA, what our negotiations package looks like, if there's any forgiveness around enrollment for a year, allowable use of ESSER dollars to accommodate for this or any other recovery services, we'd like to do some additional things. But there's a lot of components that are come into that conversation here in the next several weeks. But I think the first thing we need to try to coalesce around is how aggressive we want to be in trying to bring this back in that sense, because then that determines a lot of the other stances we would take as we work to fix the budget.
So I have a question, and I am sorry if it is a bad question. Budget stuff is the stuff I'm most unfamiliar with. Les or Chase, as I read the slide, we can only go or take advantage of budget guarantee if we have a decline in enrollment. Is that correct?
That's generally the only time that it will apply, Lisa, because it sets you back in that computation of the controlled budget, which is your enrollment times the district cost per pupil.
So if we bounce back with enrollment next year, but we have a low SSA set or whatever, we won't have the budget guarantee fallback for next year. This may be the only year that we can use it. Is that correct? And
Lisa,
then the
that-
follow-up, is there some strategy involved in thinking long and hard about whether we want to tap into budget guarantee this year?
I don't think we're likely to be in a declining enrollment situation again, especially with our historical, situation that way. And so I do think it's prudent for us to take advantage of it this year and not delaying that ask. I think, like Les said, districts that are kind of in that marginal aspect approve it on a yearly basis because they may not be sure how that's going to come in. They just make it part of their practice because they don't want to lose track of it. But Les, if you have any additional perspective you'd like to share there, go ahead. Les, you look frozen. Are you still there? I don't know if you heard me. So Les, I just shared some basic pieces. If you wanted to share anything else on that?
No, I think that, and I'm not sure where Les is on if you heard that, but no, Matt, I think that we would just echo what you're saying in terms of that is, as we look at the numbers and try to look at it, Lisa, I think we do need to have some additional conversation about whether or not this is the year to take it. And just given how significant our enrollment decline was this year, coupled with COVID, it seems to be an anomaly as you look at the past. We're not one of those districts that Matt talked about where they might gain 5 students one year and lose 10 or 20 the next 3 years. We've just historically seen increases. And so I think it is something that we will want to have some additional conversation in. And we don't know what the state's going to do. That's the other variable, right? They're supposed to set it early. And it's still hard to tell where they're going to come in on SSA as part of that conversation.
And then if we do budget guarantee, it's approximately $2 million, and that's all from a local property tax increase. So if I put my operations committee hat on and we're talking about going and asking the taxpayers for money to support a bond or other initiatives, if we're gonna take $2 million of local property tax, that would clearly impact the operation committee work. Is that safe to say? I mean, it's just another ask that we're making of our taxpayers.
Yeah. Lisa, I'm going to back up to your previous question and I'll come back to your question related to operation. In regards to the budget guarantee as to which year you might want to consider to take it, I'm reminded of a principle when I was in public accounting that was kind of an income tax driven approach, but the approach is you always accelerate resources or revenues and you defer expenditures. And so from a long-term perspective, if we were to defer the opportunity for the budget guarantee, we're probably looking at a 2, 3, or 4 year recovery cycle. If we take the budget guarantee this year and guarantee us that 1% growth, while we don't know what enrollment is going to be in SSA going forward, it accelerates or allows us to recover quicker in terms of from an operational perspective of our budget. Now to your question regarding the ask of our taxpayers, the budget guarantee that we would ask for this year would be a 1-year ask only. In looking at the operations, if you went with a general obligation bond, that would not come on to the tax base until probably 23 or 24. And so the budget guarantee amount would drop off or fall away after 1 year, so to speak. That's a very non-technical term there, but that increase for the budget guarantee this year would be a 1-year period only. And then we'd be back to a more normal tax situation for the general fund in 22, 23.
But you're right.
Does that address those
it
questions?
It does impact the work of that committee, right? Because we already talked last time about how it'll be a hard story to tell about putting these pieces together. And then, so of course, looking at this adds one other layer to it. So I think you're right. It definitely does impact, the work of that operations committee. Appreciate Les's explanation there on how the years are separated, but I think you're doing the right thing to look at it that way and how it could either further complicate that or just make it more difficult to thread the needle on how we explain that to the community.
Is there a downside to exercising the budget guarantee option?
Les, did you hear that?
The downside would not be having access to the resources. I think, Dromi, that's the easiest one, is that then we wouldn't have that income source. And so then we would be looking at less revenue. And so we would have to get those expenditures cut down even further that way. So this would, and it's a 1-year solution. It's a bridge solution. For us, it could be, even potentially more powerful than maybe in other districts that are in continual declines. If we do bounce back with some enrollment, then it's kind of the intent of that piece. But yeah, the downside would just be not having access to the resources.
Yeah. And it would be $2 million based upon the numbers that I have. To put that in perspective, from an advocacy perspective, to avoid budget guarantee this year, we would need a state supplemental amount of about 3.01%, 3.02%. So, I'm using a conservative 1% at this point in time. Those of you who haven't worked with me very long know that I do tend to go on the conservative side. So I'll be very upfront with you, but I'd rather tend to go that way than to come back to you and say, we need to cut because I was aggressive. And but again, we serve at the direction of the board and the assumptions that you want us to take in those numbers as well.
I think Dromi asked, is there a downside to exercising the budget guarantee? And correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that our attendance will rebound as well. However, if we exercise our budget guarantee, that's going to come into play when we're doing our negotiations and our packages and the overall increase. And then if enrollment doesn't go up as much as we think we are, we now have contracted amounts out there that maybe in year 2 without a budget guarantee would be tough to meet. Is that fair to say?
I'm not sure I'm following you there, Sean. I'm sorry if I misunderstood the original question.
Well, the budget guarantee is a 1-year thing,
I get what he's saying.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so we have no guarantee that year 2, I'm assuming we're not going to decline, but let's say we only go up 20 instead of getting the 280 back that we lost plus the, 200 that we usually grow. I mean, that's a huge number to get back in 1 year. I'm guessing that won't happen that quickly. Maybe it will. That would be awesome if it did. But we're taking this one-time money and basing our 1-year budget off that. When you're talking salaries and everything's a percent based on the previous year. So as we are already increasing,
I think
put us in a bind.
Yeah, yes, Sean, I think what you're articulating is the concern we always have when we see opportunities for one-time money, whether it's through the budget guarantee or the dollars coming from the federal government for COVID. Folks see these dollars out there and they think that we can do these things with them, which we can, but we have to be very cautious in terms of putting those towards a reoccurring cost, because the next year, like you're talking about, they might not be there. And so, yes, that is a caution, which is the same with any one-time funding sources, is we shouldn't be pouring those into reoccurring expenses.
Yeah, you were building off my last point about there, if it's really a true bridge solution, if our enrollment recovers, necessary. And so that's the hope, like you said, but yeah, you just articulated the risk. So thanks for pointing back again.
Now that I said that, I'm going to kind of answer the question as to where I think we need to be moving forward. And I'm going to use the thread the needle line that I think Janet likes to use, right? And if we go back to 2018, we did have to cut $5 million out of the budget one way or another, but we looked at, year after year of how we were climbing out of the hole. We all knew we were going to get in with opening Liberty and whatnot. And then, COVID comes in and kind of derails everything, and declining enrollment hurts everything. I don't think we have to immediately hit panic mode just looking at the bottom line of what, this year and next year look like, because it is an anomalous year. But at the same time, it's not magically going to be fixed next year. So I think we have to find that kind of middle ground of being somewhat aggressive on changing our unspent balance number, but not trying to fix it all immediately either, right? I think we have to think about, we will grow again and we will get some increases, But it'll take a little bit of time. So we have to do maybe some smaller steps, along with looking at the budget guarantee as the bridge type things that you've talked about, to get us to the point where we will more naturally recover. So I don't know what that fine line is, right? But that's where I think we need to target it, not go all the way this direction or this direction, right? Just find that middle ground.
Yeah, I echo that, Sean. I think for me, this trajectory, the unspent balance is becoming a burning platform. And I want to, because it's very concerning and there's so many factors out of our control. Enrollment is one. I want to go back to the 2018 decline, because I think drop in enrollment was a part of that. It wasn't just opening Liberty. And I think we did have an enrollment. We didn't meet our enrollment projection.
Yes, we didn't have a drop in enrollment, but we
Yeah.
projected many more than than our incline ended up being. You're right, Janet.
And so,
It was approximately 88 students, and we had been in the 250 to 350 or 400 per year increase. And so that felt like a drop, Janet. You're right.
made a difference, and it was a factor in why we had to go find that $5 million or whatever that number was, in addition to the increased operating expense from opening the additional schools. And so I use that point only because we say enrollment's going to keep going up, but I think it's volatile, and I don't know. I mean, and so I feel like, and we don't know what the state's going to grant us. Don't know how, to Sean, your point, how many of the students will come back from an enrollment standpoint after COVID. Have we lost these students permanently, or did they just opt out of kindergarten and will come, or preschool and will come in? I mean, there's questions there. And so I think we do need to take this very, very seriously and take some steps to, one, budget guarantee. I think that for me feels like sort of a no-brainer. But I don't think we just do that, is my humble opinion. I think we need to really look long and hard at other ways we can manage our expenses effectively, so that we are starting to rebuild that cushion. Now, maybe the state will come through, maybe they'll do some things because of COVID that would be wonderful. But until we see what's happening at the state level, I think we need to brace ourselves to do some, serious work around managing our expenses to get us on a more healthy trajectory on that unspent balance. That unspent balance, and you're doing it properly, Les. Very, very conservative estimates. And we can gauge the level of the cuts that we need to make, or the expenses that we need to manage based on what actually comes in from the state. But I think we need to be prepared to take some action to move us in the right direction with that unspent balance.
I agree, Janet. And Les, from like the School Finance 101 workshop I went to, I know that our directive is 5 to 10%, but I also feel like there's a best practice for what your unspent balance should be. Is the best practice in 5 to 10%?
That's generally the statewide initiative. You will find some districts that are approaching 20%. But one of the things that tells me is that you're not allocating all of the district resources that you've been provided to educate your students in a given year if you continue to grow or continue to use that. But the flip side of that is you can't operate at a zero level either, where you're using every single dollar every single year. And so, part of the reason for having an unspent balance is to accommodate, if for lack of a better word, those years when we have less enrollment increases than what we projected, or an enrollment decline like we do this year, or we don't receive 2.3% state new money like we did in the current year, and it's a 1% number. So, you can look at it in multiple ways, but it's a little bit of a safety net. It allows you just that little bit of margin of error when some of those factors change that are not in your control, that we've just been talking about, that both Sean and Janet have just alluded to, as you move forward from year to year. And even when you look forward, best practices is to project this out 3 to 5 years. And so that's what we've done by at least putting 23 and 24 on that one document to tell you that that we have looked ahead a little bit. But that, the last year has told us that looking ahead that far is not easy and is not a surefire thing. So we have to figure out where that sweet spot is, kind of going back to Sean's comments.
So I won't make you do math at 820, but Les, I would be interested in seeing what the unspent balance percentage would be if we took all of our budget guarantee money and just dumped it in unspent balance.
That number projected for next year already includes that number, because I had projected a budget guarantee back in October when I did that quarterly report. So
that 8.88% number includes that?
Yeah, but the current year is going to be about a flat year.
Well, that's depressing.
So to go back to Janet's point about the enrollment, we haven't talked about it in a long time, but normally we talk about our demographers report and our projections. And we had contracted with a vendor to do a new one last winter about this time. And we thought we'd have new numbers to base that on. And then of course, COVID hit. And so in our conversations, Adam leads that work for us. Really the recommendation was, look, these numbers probably aren't as valuable as they were before the pandemic. And so we don't have that piece of evidence right now. So we're in the conversations of getting a new demographer report up and running so that we can get better student projections, but we're not going to have those for January, February, March, right? That will hopefully help us down the road. But again, it's just another one of those unknowns that we couldn't control, because after 18, we decided, okay, we need better information, and we just didn't see this coming. And so that doesn't necessarily provide another data point, but just again, trying to show you where we are and some of those other things, that obstacles that we're trying to look through our crystal ball into.
Speaking of crystal balls, what do we know about the enrollment changes experienced by most of the districts in the state? And what are the associations we belong to saying about enrollment change in the next, as vaccination begins to take hold, the pandemic subsides?
That's the part where, but it's still littered with a lot of questions, Charlie, but I think there's a couple things in there, one with the state being down, almost 6,000 students. I think that speaks to, you can potentially reason that the state's not going to continue to be down 6,000 students. That many just didn't disappear. That, there's probably been a cognizant choice on families not to enroll their students during the pandemic, and so that they maybe come back. But again, it's a question mark. It's an unknown. It's not something that, when you're doing budget planning, you necessarily feel really good about planning on. The other part of this is that leaves a lot of districts, Les was alluding to this early in the presentation, in the position of needing to take advantage of the budget guarantee. That may cause some political influence in Des Moines to do something for school relief. We just don't have the answer to that question. Generally, Republicans are not ones that would like to see an increase in property tax. And so they may be inclined to do some additional benefit through SSA or allowing us to count last year's enrollment. We don't have the answers to that yet, but those would be a couple things with the declining enrollment that would potentially be outcomes of this, that the enrollment does bounce back, or that maybe the state legislature does something different that way. I would say early reports, though, out of some of the news from Des Moines tonight are not great. So I don't think we necessarily can count on some of those things either. We just have to, I think Janet described it well. It's a burning platform with where we're at with the unspent balance. And we have to be aggressive in some way and have some urgency around fixing that without, to couple that with Sean's comments, going too far and overdoing it either as we go along. But I think the budget guarantee is something we definitely just have to do and need to do. And then we need to look at where else we can control expenditures on top of that.
Just to piggyback on Matt's comments real quickly, some of the information that I've seen from my international business officials group that I'm a part of is that enrollments are down across the country.
Yeah, right. I've heard that. Yeah.
And I think that we've seen that in the news. And
Right.
so that's not a surprise. And there's various theories about why that exists. And we've talked about those a little bit tonight. You know, Iowa schools are funded a little bit differently than most states in terms of being an enrollment driven
Right,
times
yeah.
a per pupil amount. It's done differently in various states. So it's a little hard to compare that state over state. It is a challenging exercise, to say the least. And as Matt alluded to, there's been some advocacy. I know the UEN group has advocated for using a prior year's enrollment so that districts are held harmless for the declines this year of the 6,000
Right.
students. There's also some advocacy out there to talk about using the preschool enrollments from a year ago as well, because that group dropped. And so, you know, not that we wanted to get into an advocacy discussion with you tonight, but if you have those opportunities to have conversations with legislatures, these are a couple other topics in addition to the SSA amount that might be prudent to be part of that discussion, to look at what that impact is across the state, because it's not an Iowa City phenomenon, even though it feels like, you know, we're in a bad situation right now.
It's not just Iowa City, it's all the communities that are part of the district. I'm perfectly confident that the population in Johnson County did not decrease by 250 families over the last year. Populations continue to increase. And I suspect if we look at building stats in the county, we'll see that residential building is continuing as well. So I'm thinking this is a quite, the duration of this change in enrollment is going to be quite limited. I agree with Les that go ahead and take income that's available to you when it's available to you.
So I don't want to, we want all the comments you want to share, but I also realize that it's 8:30 and you all have been here a long time this evening. And so I think that we have enough information to give us some direction of how we can present some things in 2 weeks. But again, I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I want to be respectful of your time, knowing that budget is going to be a topic that we're going to get to talk about a lot over the next couple of months. And so please continue to share things with us. But I also want you to know, I think we're getting a flavor for where you are, where you want us to focus, at least as we initially bring some things back to you in a couple of weeks.
And then we can discuss what we're going to do with 2,000 kindergartners in the fall when 2 classes worth all show up.
That's why Amy's still listening. Yeah, exactly.
No more than 24 in a class.
Yeah, I think we've kind of weighed in on the various pieces, and you guys have done a good job outlining where we're at. It's not a pretty place, but I think that's not a surprise to any of us, right? We knew we were already in the midst of climbing out of kind of a hole, right? And we were doing that pretty well, I think, until this year happened. So we're going to have to make some tough choices, but I don't think we're going to have to make as many tough choices as probably the numbers would suggest, because I think there is some relief in the near future, if not just next year, at least 2 years out. So unless there's any other comments or questions, I think we can call it a night. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn at this point.
Move adjournment.
Second.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
Everybody,
thanks.
let's take a thumbs up. Janet, did you see the dog when he jumped on my lap?
I was gonna say he's adorable.
Yeah, my face is wet now, but. All right, we'll see you guys later.
Good night.
Aye.